The fire didn't kill them instantly, Robert once whispered into the pine-soaked wind. I heard my daughter crying until she didn't. Wyoming Territory, high in the Granite Ridge, early autumn of 1878. The Civil War had ended over a decade ago, but for men like Robert Boon, the echoes of battle hadn't gone quiet. They had simply turned inward into bones, into breath, into the spaces between every heartbeat. He lived 3 days' ride west of Dustwater, in an abandoned signal post tucked between granite and pine. The place was more ruin than home, a sagging roof, wind-burned walls, and a chimney that no longer remembered warmth. No one visited him. That was how he preferred it. Once Robert had been a respected field captain in the Wyoming militia, disciplined, fair, and known for leading with reason rather than rage. Then came the night that took everything. 15 years ago, his wife Miriam and daughter Clara were caught in the crossfire of someone else's hatred. A nearby Apache settlement, peaceful and allied with local settlers, had been burned to the ground. The orders had been vague. The intent had been clear. Behind the flames stood Clayton Reic, a man who hid genocide behind gospel. Robert wasn't meant to be part of the raid. But hatred has a way of spreading like fire on dry grass. By the time he arrived, everything was smoke and screams. He found his wife by the riverbank, her dress soaked in blood. His daughter, a freckled spark of life just 7 years old, lay nearby, silent, unmoving. No one was held accountable. The war was over, they said. This was just cleanup. Robert didn't argue. He buried them with his own hands, packed up the medals he no longer believed in, and vanished into the highlands. He made a vow: no more sides, no more orders, no more violence. He removed the trigger from his rifle and buried it next to Clara so it could never be used again. He hunted with traps, not bullets. He spoke only to the wind. He became a rumor wrapped in sorrow. Some said he'd gone mad. Others said he was a coward. But the truth was far simpler. Robert Boon had chosen silence. Because when the world refuses to listen, sometimes silence is all that's left. That is, until the morning. He found a woman hanging from his roof beam, half dead, with the words, "Apache Lover," scorched into the cabin door beneath her. A woman who shouldn't have been there. A woman who wasn't yet dead. And a man who had promised never to choose sides again realized some promises aren't meant to be kept. If you're still with me, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? I'd like to know. Because these stories, they don't just belong to the past. They belong to all of us. She was supposed to die quietly, but the breath in her chest said otherwise. She didn't belong there, not on that ridge beam, not with her blonde hair tangled in smoke, not with her feet dangling above pine needles and soot. But there she was, and Robert Boon had already lost too much to walk away again. The morning air bit cold against his cheeks as he moved toward her, each step sinking into the frost-kissed ground. His boots crushed last year's needles, and in his chest something old, something long buried, stirred like a flame trying to wake. He reached for the rifle at his side, then stopped. There was no trigger. He had buried that long ago, and with it the part of himself that acted without thinking. But now this wasn't instinct. It was something deeper, something human. As he stepped beneath the beam, the smell hit him first, scorched timber sweat and blood gone dry. Her head lolled forward. Dirt streaked her cheeks. Her lips were cracked. But they're barely visible beneath the collar of her dress. Her chest moved. A breath. Small. Strained. But alive. No one survives this, he thought. No one's meant to. But she had. And that was reason enough. He climbed the porch rail, braced her under the arms, and lifted. Her body was limp, but not lifeless. Her weight slight, as it was pulled hard on his aging joints. It didn't matter. Fragile things require strong hands. He carried her inside, not to the cabin, but beyond it, through a thicket of cedar and fir, down toward the small shelter he'd built years ago by a hidden spring. It was meant for emergencies, and this was one. The shelter was no more than a lean-to framed in stone and bark, but it was dry, and the spring nearby gave water colder than snowmelt. He laid her down gently, covering her in old furs and blankets. Her hair spread out across the pelts like sunshine in mud. For hours he sat beside her, feeding the fire, cooling her brow, washing the blood from her arms with spring water. Her skin was burning with fever, but her pulse, though thin, held steady. You'd think that after being nearly hanged and left to die, she'd sleep for days, but she didn't. She stirred before sunset, just once. Her lips moved almost imperceptibly. Buru. Hambor. The words weren't English. They weren't even clear, but they were urgent, as though clawing their way up from a place deeper than memory. Robert froze. Not at the sound, but at the tone. He'd heard voices like that in the field, when men lay dying and reached for mothers long dead. It was the voice of someone who had loved and lost. He leaned in. "What did you say?" he asked softly. But she had already slipped back into unconsciousness, her body shaking with fever, her breath shallow and uneven. The fire snapped behind him. Outside, night fell fast across the ridge. But inside the shelter, Robert Boon sat with a woman who should have died and hadn't. A woman branded with hate. A stranger who spoke names in dreams. He didn't know who she was, where she came from, or who might have left her hanging like a rag doll from his roof. But he knew one thing: she was alive. And whatever it took, he would not let her die here. Not in his silence. Not again. He wrapped another blanket around her trembling frame, then leaned back, arms folded across his chest. The wind outside shifted, brushing the trees like a whisper too soft to catch. And for the first time in 15 years, Robert didn't feel entirely alone. She woke with a scream and the strength of someone who had nothing left to lose. The fever broke just after midnight, but the nightmares didn't. Robert was outside splitting damp firewood when he heard her. A gasp, sharp and guttural, followed by the sound of thrashing. He rushed inside the lean-to just in time to see her flailing against the blankets, fists clenched, eyes wide and wild like a deer caught in a trap. "Get away, let me go, I'll die before you take me back." She clawed at her own throat, searching for invisible hands. Robert moved fast, grabbed her wrists not harshly, but firm enough to keep her from hurting herself. "You're safe," he said, low and steady. "You're not there anymore." But she didn't hear him. Not really. Her eyes darted around the room like she was still on the rope, still choking on smoke and shame. Then she saw the fire, and bolted. Before he could stop her, she lunged for the hearth where he kept his kindling knife. She grabbed it with shaking hands, blade trembling, breath hitching. Robert caught her by the waist and pulled her back hard against him. The knife clattered to the ground. "Don't," he whispered into her ear. "Not like this. Not when you've come this far." She froze. Her entire body trembled, but her grip loosened. Slowly the tension drained out of her limbs like water from a cracked cup. She sagged into him, not from trust, but from sheer exhaustion. Minutes passed before she spoke. "Who are you?" Her voice was hoarse, scraped raw from smoke and silence. "Name's Robert," he said gently. "Boon. This is my place, or what's left of it." "You found me?" she asked. He nodded once. Her shoulders dropped. She sat back against the wall, curling in on herself like a child. Silence stretched between them. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "My name is Annabbeth. Annabbeth Coley." Robert went still. Coley. The name hit him like a shot to the chest. He hadn't heard it spoken in years, but he'd seen it. On orders, on maps, on letters signed with the elegant looping scrawl of William Cowley, plantation baron turned land baron, cattle king of Dustwater, and the man who had funded the militia's first purge of Apache settlements. The man whose political donations paid for torches and fire. Annabbeth didn't notice the shift in Robert's posture. She just kept speaking slow and hollow like a confession. "He was my father," she said. "Or, he used to be." Her hands wrapped around her knees. "I ran away after he hit me for the last time. I didn't just run, I followed someone. He saved me when I was bleeding in the creek behind our land. Said I wasn't the enemy. Said no one is born one." She looked up at Robert, her eyes glassy but defiant. His name was Toma. He was Apache. Robert didn't speak. Not yet. "I lived with him, learned his tongue, slept under canyon stars. I wore his mother's beads. I wasn't his prisoner, I was his wife." A tear slid down her cheek. "They came for us last winter. White men. Some I knew. Some my father likely paid. They didn't knock. Didn't speak. They just set the rocks on fire and waited for the smoke to flush us out." Her voice cracked. "Toma died shielding me. I watched him fall. And I didn't scream. I couldn't. They tied me up, dragged me from town to town, burned words into wood and flesh. They called me traitor. Witch. Apache Lover." She pulled back her sleeve. The bruises had faded, but the burn scars hadn't. "They hung me where no one would care, to make sure no girl like me ever tried to love someone like him again." Silence pressed into the space between them. The fire popped. Robert stared at the floor, fists clenched in his lap. Then finally he spoke. "You can hate me," she whispered, barely audible. "Everyone else does." He looked up at her, voice low but certain. "I don't hate you." Her eyes widened. "You think I betrayed my kind?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "I think the ones who say that never knew what love looked like." She blinked. A long silence passed before her lips trembled. "I should have died with him." Robert reached for the fire poker, stirred the coals, and said quietly, more to himself than to her, "You didn't. And that ain't betrayal. That's survival. Some men don't chase justice. They chase ghosts just to hang them twice." She didn't cry again that night. Not after the story. Not after the silence that followed. Annabbeth just sat by the fire, arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes wide open, but looking nowhere. Robert didn't press her. He didn't offer comfort. Some wounds don't want hands, they want space. But long after she drifted into uneasy sleep, Robert remained awake, staring into the orange flicker of flames, jaw clenched. Because now he knew. He knew who she was. He knew who she had loved. And he knew exactly the kind of men who would kill her just for surviving. He had seen them before, riding hard in the night fire in their hands and scripture in their mouths. He knew their leader, too. Because Clayton Reic wasn't a stranger. He was a shadow Robert had spent 15 years trying to outrun. The man who once called half-bloods abominations. The man who said sympathy breeds weakness. The man who had laughed the night the Apache village burned. And now Reic had heard a whisper, the girl is still alive. In a smoky saloon 2 towns south, a bottle hit the table, and a war from 15 years ago started breathing again. The town was called Fletcher's Bluff, little more than a string of crooked buildings and broken men, and in the back of its only saloon, Clayton Reic sat with his boots on a barrel, polishing the same custom revolver he'd used since the war. A rider burst through the door, dusty and nervous. "Saw her," the man said, glancing around. "Up in the Granite Ridge. Hanging, but not dead. Someone cut her down." Reic didn't move at first. He just let the silence stretch like leather drying in sun. Then he stood, slow, deliberate. "You sure it was her?" he asked. "Blonde, young, scars on her arms. A mountain man carried her off. Big fella, gray coat, lived near an old station cabin." A flicker passed through Reic's eyes, not surprise but memory. Hatred aged like whiskey, the kind of loathing that doesn't fade with time. It ferments. "Robert Boon," he said flatly. "Should have known that coward would go soft." Within the hour, 6 men were saddled and ready. No badges, no law. Just rope and kerosene. They didn't speak much as they rode. Men like them didn't need speeches. They had one rule: what fire didn't finish, rope would. Back in the hills, Robert felt it first, not in the wind, but in his gut. A cold weight beneath the ribs. He rose from the cot just before dawn, checked the traps, listened to the forest. 3 tripwires had been sprung, but no sound, no warning. Just absence. Like the forest was holding its breath. He returned to the cabin without a word. Annabbeth looked up from the fire, her tea untouched. "They're coming," she said quietly. Robert nodded once. "You should run," she added. "They'll kill you for protecting me." "Then let them try," he answered. She opened her mouth to argue, but his voice came first. "I lost a wife and child because I stood still. Watched fire take everything. I won't do that again." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without asking, she began packing her satchel. Not because she wanted to leave, but because part of her still believed she wasn't worth staying for. Robert watched her quietly, then turned toward the door. "Stay inside," he said. "No lights, no sound. I'll slow them down." And just like that, the man who once vowed never to choose sides again walked into the woods to make a stand, not with bullets, but with strings, snares, broken glass, and old tins tied to branches. Because sometimes a man doesn't fight to win. Sometimes he fights to say no more. You can bury a rifle. You can bury your past. But when the fire comes back, the question is simple: will you stand or vanish again? The traps were set. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. Robert crouched in the brush above the narrow ridge trail, eyes scanning the tree line as dawn crept up behind him like an old enemy. Every twig, every gust of wind through the branches made his pulse tighten. He hadn't hunted men in 15 years, but the body doesn't forget. Below, a trio of riders crept forward, all rope and kerosene and dead-eyed resolve. One of them dragged a coil of wire. Another had a limp. The third, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, carried a bottle of kerosene like it was holy water. They weren't coming to arrest her. They weren't coming to warn. They came to finish what they'd started years ago. Robert exhaled slowly. "You don't need to shoot," he reminded himself. "You just need to buy time." The first man triggered a tin can alarm. It rattled loud, and he froze. Robert dropped behind him like a shadow and struck elbow to throat, knife to wrist. Not to kill, just to take the fight out of him. The second spun too late. A punch to the jaw dropped him fast, but the third saw it and shouted, The first shot fired in 15 years cracked through the pines, and it wasn't from Robert's gun. Gunfire echoed, bark exploded from a nearby tree. Back at the cabin, Annabbeth froze. Then she stood. Not to run, but to act. She grabbed the old lantern, a flint, and a bundle of dried cedar bark from the hearth. "If they want fire," she muttered, "let's see how they like it." Outside, Robert ducked behind a fallen log. His coat was torn at the shoulder, his breath ragged. The third man closed in, revolver drawn. Then the woods lit up. Flames licked the dry underbrush, leaping tree to tree in a furious orange bloom. Annabbeth had set the slope alight, cutting off the men's retreat and forcing chaos into their ranks. The third man turned, blinded by smoke. Robert tackled him, knocked the gun loose, and dragged him into the dirt. They didn't kill anyone, but they made sure no one would come back soon. They stumbled through the smoke, choking, coughing lungs, stinging. Robert's coat singed. Annabeth's dress blackened at the hem. They didn't speak until they reached the mouth of an old winter cave, an old hideout Robert hadn't used since before Clara was born. Inside, the air was damp but cool, safe for now. They collapsed in silence. Annabbeth winced as Robert reached to brush a burned strand of hair from her face. "You set the woods on fire," he said, almost smiling. "Just a little," she rasped. "You could have died." "I know." He stared at her eyes, soft but steady. "Would you have died for me?" She didn't blink. "No," she whispered. "I want to live for you." The cave stayed silent, but something inside both of them shifted. Not survival, not rage, but something older, quieter. A choice neither of them had dared make in years. If you've been riding along with this story and it's stirred something in you, just type 1 in the comments. And if not, that's all right too, type 0 and tell me why. These aren't just stories. They're echoes. And your voice is part of the trail they leave behind. You can outrun fire. You can outrun men. But grief, that one walks beside you until you offer it a seat. The cave gave them a place to breathe, but not to rest. The smoke from the forest still clung to their clothes, to their skin, to the silence between every word. For hours, neither Robert nor Annabbeth spoke. They sat shoulder to shoulder, staring at the flickering light of a stolen lantern, their chests rising and falling in quiet sync. Outside, the fire had dulled to smoke. The men who hunted them had fled or fallen. But no one smiled. Because safety wasn't the same as peace, and survival wasn't the same as living. The next morning, before the sun had crested the far ridge, Robert stood and stretched. His back ached, but his legs were steady. He turned to Annabbeth, still wrapped in a wool blanket near the cave wall. "Stay here," he said gently. "I'll be back before nightfall." "Where are you going?" she asked, voice raw. "To start over." He said he wasn't building a home, but every stone he laid whispered otherwise. Half a mile deeper into the forest, Robert found it again, the old hunter's hut. Long abandoned, the roof half gone, vines choking the doorframe. But the bones were there just like him, weathered but not broken. He cleared the brush, chopped rotted wood, and stripped the mold from the beams with his bare hands. He patched the roof with bark and birch, fixed the door, rebuilt the hearth. And when the shadows grew long, he dug into the earth and planted 3 rows of potato sprouts and wild onion. He didn't ask her permission. He didn't tell her his plans, because what he was building wasn't for pride. It was for dignity. When Annabbeth arrived the next morning, mud on her boots, hair still damp from the spring, she stood in the doorway for a long time, not saying a word. The little hut stood tall again. Crude, simple, solid. But beside it, what truly stopped her was the soil tilled and ready with the first shoots of green daring to rise through the ash. "You built this," she said quietly. "You needed space," he answered, "and something to come back to." "I never asked," she whispered. "You didn't need to." She stepped across the threshold, sat on the edge of the bedding he'd laid out, and stared out at the soil as if it held every ghost she'd buried. Then, without a sob, without words, she cried. Not the frantic cries of terror or grief, not the broken howls of a woman being hunted, just soft, slow, quiet tears. Tears of permission. Tears of someone allowed for the first time to let go without falling apart. Robert didn't move closer. He didn't speak. Because this wasn't about being rescued. This was about being allowed to stay broken and still be seen. Later that evening, they sat outside as dusk painted the trees in gold. Annabbeth broke a small sprig of thyme between her fingers, held it to her nose, and smiled just barely. "My mother grew thyme," she said. "She said it kept the snakes away." "It didn't work on men," Robert muttered. She laughed, and the sound, brief and sudden, shocked them both. It was the first time either had laughed in years. Some stories heal in silence. Others need to be told where they can be heard, especially by the ones who once refused to listen. The night air around the rebuilt cabin was gentle, pine-scented still. Annabbeth sat on the step, her bare feet in the soil, where thyme now grew wild beside onion sprouts and stubborn squash leaves. Robert sat beside her, whittling a piece of cedar, not really shaping it, just moving the knife like it helped him think. They'd survived fire, rope, shame. But something else lingered the knowing. That out there in Dustwater, men still told a different story. That she was a traitor. That he was a coward. That what they shared was a scandal, not a life. "They'll never believe me," she said softly. "Then we don't ask them to," Robert replied. "We show them." They weren't riding back to make peace, they were riding back to end a lie. They left at first light, taking only what they needed. A borrowed wagon from a kindly farmer. A bundle wrapped tight in Robert's coat. The journey was long, the road dusty, and every town they passed greeted them with the same thing, silence. Some glances were curious. Others were cutting. By the time they reached Dustwater, the sun was near its peak, and the streets buzzed with whispered rumors because word had traveled faster than their wheels. At the trading post, Robert stood near the sugar barrels listening. One man mentioned Reic's name. Another mentioned the mayor's office. There was talk of bounty hunters, of new laws, of cleansing the borders again. Robert turned and left without a word. He'd heard enough. Down the hill in the wagon, Annabbeth waited. She didn't ask what he heard. "It's him," Robert said. "He's here." She nodded and reached into her satchel. What she pulled out wasn't a weapon, but a memory. A burnt piece of leather blackened at the edges with the word Apache Lover seared in jagged, deliberate script. It was nailed to the cabin door, she said. But it wasn't just hate. It was handwriting. Robert raised an eyebrow. "Reic used to write letters to my father. Threats, bargains, warnings. I remember the shape of the P, the way the A dips. It was his hand." They stared at the word together, not with fear, but with purpose. "He doesn't want me dead because I broke his law," she said. "He wants me dead because I survived loving someone he couldn't control." Robert nodded. "Then let's give them something he can't burn, truth." They visited the chapel first. In the old records room behind the altar, Annabbeth found what she hoped for, a half-charred copy of one of Reic's letters to her father, stored for tax purposes when land was donated to the church. The handwriting matched, the language matched, and the intent clear as blood on snow. Next, they visited the marshal's office. The new deputy, young but watchful, listened as Robert laid the items on the table. "We're not here to hang anyone," Robert said. "We're here to show you the rope." Annabbeth stepped forward, her voice steady. "I don't need this town to love me. I just need it to look me in the eye and finally see a person." The deputy looked between them, and then quietly he nodded. The courthouse steps were set for the next day. The mayor would be present. A panel of elders. No trials, just testimony. But sometimes truth doesn't need a judge. It just needs to be heard. A bullet might silence a man, but scars, they speak for a lifetime. The sun rose slow over Dustwater, but the townsfolk were faster. By the time the courthouse bell rang noon, a quiet crowd had gathered near the steps. Not because they were called, but because the truth, once it starts knocking, tends to bring folks to the door. Mayor Holt sat under a makeshift canopy, sweat beading at his temple. Beside him, 3 town elders, faces drawn, hands tight on armrests. The deputy stood at the edge of the platform, arms crossed, guarding more than law, guarding the moment. And then they came. Robert Boon walked in first, hat low, eyes steady. He carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Beside him, Annabbeth Cowley, her back straight, her hands empty, her eyes unwavering. The crowd parted like grass before a storm. She didn't bring a speech. She didn't bring a weapon. She brought the truth and the wounds to prove it. Bert began. He said little, just enough. He laid out the burnt leather, showed the crowd the slur scorched into its skin. Then he held up the letter from Reic to William Cawley, words dripping with venom, naming his own daughter a disgrace, calling for purity by flame. The handwriting matched. The hatred even more so. Then he unwrapped the third item, an old photograph yellowed by time. It showed a line of soldiers outside a burning Apache village. One figure stood at the center, tall, bearded, revolver holstered low. The same revolver now slung at Clayton Reic's hip, where he stood at the edge of the crowd, arms folded, face carved from stone. That weapon, Robert said to the mayor, was issued to only 6 field captains. One of them belonged to Clayton Reic. "You tell me who was there." The mayor's throat bobbed, but he said nothing. Reic stepped forward, his voice cut like gravel. "This is a circus," he barked. "Lies from a man who ran from war and a girl who bedded the enemy." Some murmured. A few nodded. Most stayed silent. And then came the voice no one expected. "I was there." An old man emerged from the shade by the sheriff's office. Bent back, clouded eyes, wooden cane, but his voice clear as glass. "I was a field surgeon that night, the night of the Dustwater raid. Reic gave the order, no quarter, no mercy. We burned them alive. They never raised a hand." Reic scoffed. "Drunken lies." The old man turned, eyes glassy. "You buried your guilt in whiskey. I buried mine in silence. But only one of us still dreams of fire." Silence pressed down like snowfall. Annabbeth stepped forward, alone. She turned her back to the crowd, and slowly, with trembling fingers, she untied the back of her blouse and let the fabric slip low enough to reveal the scars. Twisted, raised, red around the edges, rope burns, brands. She turned, eyes shining, voice soft but strong. "These weren't made by Apache blades. These weren't done in the wild. These were made by white hands, Christian hands, men who said they were saving me." She paused. Not to cry, not to breathe, but to let it land. "Toma didn't own me. He loved me. He taught me to plant, to listen. He died protecting me." She faced Reic. You didn't hang me to punish love. You did it to silence it. No one clapped. No one cheered. But no one looked at Reic the same again. The silence Dustwater had carried for 15 years cracked wide open. And from that break, something new began to grow. Some people spend a lifetime searching for a place to belong. Others build it stone by scar, breath by breath. Robert and Annabbeth didn't stay to see Reic fall. At dawn, they left Dustwater behind, carrying only seeds, silence, and the quiet weight of a life they were ready to begin. Back in the mountains, the cabin stood waiting. They fixed what they could, grew what they needed, and spoke little. Not out of fear, but because peace doesn't shout. And then, the lost began to arrive. A boy and a Cheyenne girl cast out by their kin. A woman with a scar and no home. A wounded child. A limping horse. No one asked questions. No one needed to. Robert expanded the shelter. Annabbeth brewed herbs and healed wounds. There were no sermons, no rules, just room to breathe. One evening, dust on his boots and hope in his eyes, Robert stood beside her. No ring, no preacher. Just tell me you'll still be here when the sun drops behind that tree. She smiled softly. Toma taught me fire, she whispered. But you taught me stillness. Some loves burn bright and fast. Others smolder slow, steady, quiet enough to last a lifetime. The seasons turned. Snow dusted the ridge. Wildflowers bloomed and died only to bloom again. Life didn't rush anymore. It settled like mist in the morning, like breath after a long run. Robert never asked Annabbeth to marry him, not with a ring, not with words. And she never needed him to, because staying, that was the vow. They planted squash in the spring and thyme in the fall, took in a boy who carved toys for the children, and a girl who taught others how to read. No one called it a community. No one needed to name it. It simply became. One evening, Annabbeth tucked a folded letter into the pages of a donated book left at the Dustwater schoolhouse. It wasn't signed. Just a few lines in elegant script. Toma taught me how to fight. Robert taught me how to stay. I've learned that love isn't how loud you speak or how hard you chase. It's the quiet promise of someone who remains when the fire dies out. The cabin still stands today, tucked between the pines, where no road leads but some hearts still wander. And now I want to ask you something. Have you ever loved someone? Not because they saved you, but because they stayed. Tell me below, what does real love look like to you? Type it in the comments. Just one sentence, one memory, one name. Because maybe, just maybe, someone out there is waiting to feel a little less alone. Thanks for riding with us through this Wild West love story. If it stirred something in you, you know what to do. Stay a little longer. We've got more stories to tell.